Boys not getting that manhood training, not receiving that Yoda training, is a part of why these boys are shooting up these young men have problems and are shooting up these schools. You know, the father is the most important element in a family. It is necessary. But now people sort of shun that and say, oh no, it's not necessary.
Kathleen Wells, welcome on the show.
Thanks for having me.
You're the host of the Naked Truth Report, and you're here to tell us how the Black community is doing in California.
Right. That's something that my show, The Naked Truth Report, which airs on AM 870, The Answer, KRLA, on Sundays at 7 p.m., that's something that my show focuses on. In fact, that's the foundation for the show.
And you got into politics, you got inspired by Obama, and now you have a show that...
I got involved with I think most blacks got really involved in politics when Obama got more intimately involved when Obama was running for office. In fact, I even volunteered for his campaign. And that's when I got really involved. I think he ran in, 2006, before he started, 2006, when he was getting involved, getting ready to run. I volunteered for his campaign because this was historic. You know, a black man having
He was charismatic, right?
He was charismatic, but I think that a black president, it was historic. And he was inspiring, you know, he was intelligent. So I think many blacks got really involved in politics. Even though I have an undergraduate degree in political science and a law degree, I was involved in politics in a superficial way. But when Obama ran, I got involved intimately with it. And so that started my interest, you know, Obama running for office. That started me getting intimately involved.
And what happened next?
And I started writing for the Huffington Post. I wrote articles for the Huffington Post. And the Huffington Post asked me to cover an Acorn event where someone was losing their house in Watts. And Acorn was involved in some way. Acorn was an organization that dealt with housing issues and things of that matter that impact low-income residents. So I drove out to Watts, and lo and behold, Roseanne Barr was at the event. So instead of interviewing the homeowner, I said, gee, because I wanted to get my written articles, my written interviews on the front cover of the Huffington Post. They weren't getting there. And for some reason at that time, I felt it was sort of like necessary to get on the front page. You know, it would raise my profile because I wanted to get known as a writer, right? I wanted to raise my popularity. So when I went to that Acorn event in Watts, lo and behold, Roseanne Barr was actually there. I said, gee, an interview with Roseanne Barr is gonna get me on the front cover of the Huffington Post. So I asked Roseanne Barr if she would do an interview with me. And she said yes. And that's how, in that interview, it didn't, I don't know if it got on the front cover, but it did get a lot of notoriety. And I befriended Roseanne Barr, and I became friends. And she had a radio show at that time with KCAA, which is in the Inland Empire. And she asked me to sit in to do one of her shows, to host one of her shows, you know, as a sort of a substitute for her because she wasn't able to do the show. So that's how I got it started in the radio business, by sitting in for Roseanne Barr's show as a host.
And then from there, now you are in KRLA.
Right.
And your political view is completely shifted. What happened? What did you see?
So when I substitute in for her, and I did a show this was around the time that Scott Walker and the Wisconsin thing was taking place, all that controversy. So I discussed that on the show, and the folks at KCA asked me if I would like to have my own show. So that's how that started. I started doing my own show, but for Roseanne, I wouldn't be in the radio business. So I started doing my own show, The Kathleen Wells Show. And at that point, because I was involved with Obama being president, and I believed in Obama, because this is the first black man being a president. He was, I don't want to say articulate, because that's what Joe Biden said or whoever, and that's sort of like stereotypical, like black folks aren't supposed to be articulate or something like that. But he was inspiring.
He was very inspiring.
And I believed in
very
him.
inspiring.
You believed in him. I only voted for him once. You believed in him. So when I started my own show, The Kathleen Welsh Show in the Inland Empire, that's when I started getting really, really, really involved in politics, intimately involved in politics, digging and looking at the details and looking at the data and really getting involved and passionate about politics. And what I did was, aside from interviewing Democrat, liberal politicians who were supporters of Obama, Democratic politicians. I voted Democrat all my life, as most Black Americans have voted Democrat for many decades. But once I started getting more involved, learning the information more intimately, interviewing Dr. Claude Anderson and learning about how high immigration and illegal immigration adversely impacts Black America and has for decades. And high immigration has adversely impacted Black America since the 1800s. In fact, Booker T. Washington wrote about that. Frederick Douglass wrote about that. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about that. And Marcus Garvey wrote about that. All the Black intellectuals and all the Black newspapers and academicians during the 1800s wrote about how high immigration adversely impacted Black America, how they were supplanting Black American workers who just left slavery. So I started learning this information, this history.
You started history.
I started learning this history, and knowing history is important. Context is important. This is something that I stress on my radio show. Knowing the full history. And I think the problem with a lot of folks today, they don't know the full history and they don't know the full accurate history. Well, I started to learn the full accurate history when I was doing the Kathleen Welsh Show. And what my interviews with Dr. Claude Anderson and seeing all of his videos on YouTube of Dr. Claude Anderson and others also awakened me, gave me more information, enabled me to sink my teeth into what was actually going on. I was thirsty for the knowledge. And once you get the knowledge, once you realize what the actual history was, once you realize that high immigration adversely impacted Black America, we move forward to today, 2020, and Black Americans are still relegated to a permanent underclass. Because not only are we competing with immigration, high immigration, which started in the 1800s, as I mentioned before, and then the 1965. But now Black Americans are competing with illegal aliens. And in fact, on my radio show, I had the building inspector for Los Angeles on the radio show. And he said that 80 to 90% of the construction jobs in Los Angeles are held by illegal aliens. So Black Americans, Black men, I focus on Black men because men have to head households. And this is something Martin Luther King talked about. The man has to head the household. So even in when I had the building inspector on the show, he was talking about the fact that 80 to 90% of construction jobs are held by illegal aliens. So this is something that has happened subsequent to the Immigration Act of 1965. This started happening in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. It's probably exacerbated in the 90s. It's just phenomenal, the numbers. And this is keeping Black Americans relegated to a permanent underclass. That's what the data tells us.
Do you see the Black community now compared to a few generations ago? How do you think the Black community is doing?
I think they're doing worse. We know the data is clear. Black Americans will face zero median wealth by 2053. We're just not being able to compete, not because we're incapable of competing, because we know the data. We know when there was segregation that Black Americans had 40% of their businesses and 87% two-parent families. When you destroy the family, you're destroying the fabric of society.
And what has happened when you mentioned destroying the family? What do you mean by that?
Well, and that started with free sex feminism. I call it free sex feminism. I may have coined that myself, I don't know. But I say with free sex feminism and LBJ's Great Society, but definitely free sex feminism. So the feminist movement brought have sex with whoever you want, whenever you want. So women are having sex with, because they're free. They're feminists. They don't have to wear bras, they can have sex. The hippie movement, you can have sex with anybody you want to have sex with. And what does that end up happening? That you have sex without commitment. Having sex without getting a commitment from the man a woman is having sex with means that a lot of people will end up having kids without the marriage.
Fathers. And the marriage, yeah.
And it's just continued on for decades and exacerbated. I mean, today the data is something like 75% of Black families are single-headed. I'm a traditionalist. I'm old-fashioned. I was raised with both parents. But for my father, I wouldn't be who I am today. He was the most instrumental person in my life. Every opportunity I've had was because of my father. I've seen the disintegration of the Black community. We don't even really have Black communities because a community consists of having businesses in that area. We have Black neighborhoods. I grew up in Leimert Park. My father bought a home in Leimert Park in Los Angeles in 1962. Our neighbors were white. In fact, my neighbor was like my Aunt Betty. Aunt Betty and Uncle Clyde, they looked after me when I was growing up, you know. Tammy was their Aunt Betty's niece. She would come every summer. I think she grew up in, if I'm not mistaken, Huntington Beach or Huntington Beach, I think. No, Garden Grove. She grew up in Garden Grove. Tammy was like my best friend during the summers. So my neighbors were white in Leimert Park. Most of the whites in Leimert Park during that time, during the 60s and 70s, moved out. But Aunt Betty and Uncle Clyde stayed, and they were our neighbors. And then our neighbors across the street were the Takiyamas. Kathy Takayama was my sister's best friend. So Leimert Park during the 60s and 70s was a Black neighborhood. There were some whites still there, like Aunt Betty and Uncle Clyde, and there were Japanese. There was a Japanese area there. But this was the neighborhood then. This is the neighborhood I grew up in. And most families had two parents during that time. And we can fast forward to today, and you see that all groups, it's most adversely impacted Black Americans because Black Americans, again, being relegated to the permanent underclass because of Black Code sunset laws, convict leasing, Jim Crow, all that stuff. Then LBJ Great Society, Jim Crow, then LBJ Great Society, give the woman a welfare check. She doesn't need a man in the family. Patrick Moynihan talked about that. You need traditionalism works.
Has that become part of the culture where people think about the welfare check and they just rely on that?
Well, I don't know the exact data, like what percentage of Black Americans rely
based on what you've seen and based on what.
Well, I grew up. Leimert Park is like working class, middle class neighborhood. So the Black, Leimert Park was not poor Black people who had to rely on welfare. These were working class, middle class, home owning Black Americans. Families, two-parent families. So I'm not.
You haven't witnessed that side.
Not so much, you see.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't know the data, but I was raised in a family with two parents. My father came from a big family. My grandfather was born in 1895 in Dallas, Texas. My father was born in Dallas, Texas. Jonas Wells was my grandfather, born in 1895. He owned his own farm. He died before I was born, but when I looked up his information on the internet, and he had his own home, he had his own account, he had his own farm. And in fact, after he died, my father and his siblings inherited money, much money, because I think they've inherited. In fact, I know they inherited many siblings. 4 or 5 siblings inherited money over years. In fact, I know Dad inherited when I was in law school in 1989, and he was able to buy property. So I think my grandfather owned a lot of, I don't know the exact numbers, and I'd like to look into that. And in fact, there's a street, my cousins told me, my first cousins told me that there's a street named after my grandfather, Wells, in Dallas, Texas. So presumably he owned a lot of land in Dallas. And in fact, my father used to tell the story that even my grandmother, his wife, was sort of cheated out of that, but still it was sufficient. It was a sufficient amount.
So there was a lot of wealth at that time.
Yeah, there was. In other words, he owned a lot of acreage that the siblings were able to inherit money periodically over the years.
So what I'm hearing is that today we have challenges where black families, we don't have a lot of black families with two parents.
I think that's the most important thing that I'm trying to get through, that you must have, to succeed in society, you must have a mother and a father in the home. And that black families have been disintegrated with LBJ's Great Society and free sex feminism.
Do you think the attitudes change, the attitude of people towards working hard and having those values? Do you think there's been a change in that?
No, I think that the whole social milieu of American society has changed with liberal ideology.
There's another challenge that I see going on is that minorities are victimized. And as a result of it, kids don't want to, they think they don't have a chance. They don't have a chance to go to a good university. They think they don't have a chance to do something big because of social pressures. What do you think of that?
I think that this whole victim mentality came around during the 60s, the Black Power movement and all that. This is because you see, blacks were making it when, you know, I talk about the fact that my grandfather was born in 1895 and owned his own farm and had his own accountant, had his own home. So my grandfather was very successful in that regard, yes. There's a street named after him. He was born in 1895. So you see, when we were
He had that opportunity at that time.
He was independent. He was an entrepreneur. He was a farmer, rather. He was independent. He had this freedom. He wasn't relying on the government. So what the civil rights era did, brought in the government, the federal government, to be the daddy. And it made the attitude changed, you see. And in fact, do you realize that the first real estate tycoon in Los Angeles was a black woman, Biddy Mason. She was a slave that
I didn't know that.
She couldn't read or write. And she was a real estate tycoon. She was a slave, Biddy Mason was a slave, and she became a real estate tycoon. And there's several examples of stories like this. Madam C.J. Walker became the first millionaire woman. So my position that I take, and I'm writing a book on this, the Democratic Party, liberal ideology destroyed Black America. Liberal ideology destroyed all of America, because people don't have daddies in the home anymore. And Judge Joe Brown, who appears on my show regularly, he talks about boys not getting that manhood training, not receiving that Yoda training, is a part of why these boys are shooting up these young men have problems and are shooting up these schools. You know, the father is the most important element in a family. It is necessary. But now people sort of shun that and say, oh, no, it's not necessary. They're brainwashed.
Well, Kathleen Wells, it was great to chat with you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you for having me. I appreciate being here. And I want to tell your viewers to tune in to the Naked Truth Report, which airs every Sunday on KRLA AM 870. The Answer, Sunday at 7 p.m. Please, you're going to want to watch it. And you can see some of my archive shows. You go to the Naked Truth Report YouTube channel and see some of my old interviews, my archive shows.
Excellent.
Thank you.